Hey all, what's going on? So this is going to be episode 6 of our archery series. This one is going to be on quivers and broadheads for hunting. So for those of you that don't know, a quiver is what holds your arrows. So this is a typical hunting quiver. This kind is convenient. It just clips onto a mount you put on your bow and locks in there. She's not going anywhere. Usually what I'll do is I'll have it like this when I go into the stand, unlock it, pop it out, set my bow down, and then I'll just take my arrow out that I'm going to hunt with, and I'll hang this on a limb or something. They're pretty convenient. You can usually get them for a couple bucks. I don't know, probably 15, 20 bucks on the cheap end, or you can get more expensive ones. Find the arrow I want here, yep. Highly recommend it. It's better than just carrying arrows randomly. So now broadheads. So we've talked about arrows already, so you guys have a little bit of an understanding on the arrow and a little bit of the anatomy of it. So with the tip of the arrow, that's obviously the business end of the arrow, so we really want to make sure we pay attention and put the money into that and don't skimp on that. So that's my first little spiel. Most people are probably familiar with a field point, which I can grab. So a field point, this is what people are probably most familiar with. It's basically just a small aerodynamic tip that goes into your arrow. Most people target practice with those. That's what competition shooters use and stuff like that. Some people use them for small game and things. There's like blunt points and judo points and things like that that you can get that are more specific to small game. I've never particularly used any of them. For these videos, we're mostly talking about deer hunting, big game hunting. You know, you could apply these same concepts to turkey hunting too. So now the broadhead that you're going to use for hunting. So there's two types. There's fixed blade and then there's mechanical. Those are the overarching general types. Fixed blade is going to be the blades on the actual broadhead are fixed. You can't move them, you can't adjust them or anything like that unless you take the whole tip out of the arrow. Usually they sit in little grooves inside the main shaft that you screw that in, and the tension's what holds the blades in there. They have their pros and cons. So some pros are that they're very deadly. There's no not deploying or whatever. The blade is always going to be there and exposed, so that's good. If the arrow gets stuck in the deer, so if it passes through and hits that back shoulder and it stays in there, it's going to constantly be cutting up the whole time the arrow's in there, so that's always good. And there's not tons of room for error other than the actual shot itself. They are harder to sight in. That is a disadvantage just because the fixed blades, so you can get 2 fixed blades, 3 or 4 fixed blades some people use, and they act as another set of fletchings or vanes on your arrow, which means that there's 2 ends trying to steer it and they're on opposite ends, so that makes it a little tougher. Back when I used to shoot fixed blades, I would use a longer vane. I'd use a feather vane just because it gave it some more stability. So it does usually require a little bit more time sighting in, and it usually requires more of a precise release and shot compared to a mechanical. So mechanical is basically, this is a mechanical here, and basically, at least for this brand, it sits like that, almost like an X, and then as it hits the deer, the blades pop out and they're fully deployed. So some advantages and disadvantages of mechanical. An advantage is they shoot very true and very straight. So they shoot most of the time just like a field point that we talked about initially in the beginning. So they're very accurate. There's not going to be that second set of vanes really controlling the arrow. You might get a little bit here and there. Most of them come with a practice point that's not sharp and that doesn't actually have blades, but it has outlines of blades so you can test your arrow flight. A nice advantage of that is you don't beat up your target nearly as much as you would with a fixed blade broadhead, and you can practice with field points and get the same type of result. So as you shoot, as I said earlier, it hits the deer, and then the 2 blades, 2 or 3, sometimes 4, will deploy. Gives you a much larger cutting surface than a fixed blade. So generally a fixed blade's cutting diameter for the whole broadhead is going to be 3/4 of an inch to an inch. Some get a little bit bigger than that, but then you're getting a pretty big broadhead. With the mechanical, it can be 1.5 inches, 2 inches. Some even are up to 2.5 inches. That's a pretty big cutting area. I think some might be up to 3. I'm not 100% sure on that. And that's a big hole to put into a deer. So the blood trails generally, from my experience, are much better with a mechanical broadhead. Some disadvantages are you could have an early deployment, so the blades deploy early, then your arrow doesn't have a true flight, and it's not as lethal. or they don't deploy at all, so then you have just a little hole the size of your arrow in the deer. Most of the time in that case, unless it's a really, really good shot, you're going to struggle to find the deer or find blood. Or if your arrow does get stuck inside the deer in the back shoulder or something, the blades could collapse back in, and then you don't have that same cutting surface as you do with a fixed when it gets stuck in there. So those are some advantages and disadvantages. I used to shoot fixed blades, shot them for probably 4 or 5 years. My dad, my brother, and I, we all did. Then my dad switched to the mechanicals, and my brother switched to the mechanicals. I was a little skeptical because it was when they were first starting to come out. So I stayed with the fixed, and my brother shot a deer, and I could not believe the blood trail that this thing left. I mean, there were 2 holes that big, and an entry hole and an exit hole, and there was a blood trail like you couldn't believe. It was super easy to follow, full of blood, clean pass through. And so now I've decided to switch. We shoot Rage. The 3 of us, we shoot Rage. They kind of, as far as I know, they kind of pioneered the mechanical broadhead change and revolution, I guess you could say, within the hunting broadhead industry. They're probably one of the more common broadheads that you'll find guys shooting. In terms of the non-deployment rate or the early deployment rate, I've never had it happen. Nobody I directly know has had it happen, but it does happen. I've heard other guys say that it's happened. Friend of a friend said it's happened. You see it all the time online, and so that is a drawback. Although it isn't like all the time, it can happen. And if it's a 150 class deer, you're not going to be very happy if that happens, and you're going to want to wish you had the fixed blade. But majority of time, I'd say that the mechanical is probably more advantageous for a larger penetration hole and just a better blood trail, and it's going to cut more because there's a larger cutting diameter when it penetrates the deer. So that's just my quick little spiel. One thing with mechanical is you do have to watch to make sure that they're not deployed. Some of them will have like a little rubber band or something around it. This one I took apart for the purposes of the video. But yeah, one thing you kind of want to also check up, you want to check the sharpness of the blades. Obviously you want them sharp, you don't want them too dull, and then you want to check the weight because that'll change the flight of the arrow. But that's just a real quick spiel on broadheads, which kind I prefer, why I prefer them, and the disadvantages and advantages of both. You can't really go wrong either way. I would say the mechanical is probably the better choice now. The technology is better, they fly truer, and they have a larger cutting surface. But go down to your local pro shop, talk to your local buddy that knows what he's doing with this kind of stuff. He'll be able to help set you up with the proper broadhead for your specific arrow and your specific bow setup and what you're trying to accomplish. So hopefully you guys found this video helpful. As always, thanks for watching, and feel free to leave a comment on any of our social media platforms, DM us, whatever. We're always looking for user feedback and for suggestions on videos. Yeah, thanks for watching.